Hi, everyone. Good Tuesday afternoon, and welcome to GoLocal Live. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for catching us for most folks on a short holiday week. And if you just saw us pop up, we were at Providence College, where the men's soccer team is prepping for their third-round game versus Clemson. Speaking of college, University of Virginia professor Jennifer Lawless joining to talk politics ahead of Turkey Day. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be with you.
So, big news today. House Judiciary has announced they have scheduled their first formal impeachment hearing for December 4th. Now that we're moving over to Judiciary, what can we expect?
Well, I think a couple of things. The first is that Adam Schiff and the Intelligence Committee investigated in large part because Adam Schiff is known for not having a lot of drama and for sort of very competently executing a set of hearings. Jerry Nadler, who's the chair of the Judiciary Committee, has had his ups and downs. He had that famous or now infamous problem with Corey Lewandowski when he testified before the committee, and it was basically a free-for-all, and most people would assess it as a Lewandowski win. So I think there's a little bit more uncertainty as to how well these hearings are going to go. But I mean, Adam Schiff has basically given the Judiciary Committee all of the information that they need, and it's now just going to be a matter of determining what articles of impeachment to draft. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that Donald Trump's lawyers, White House lawyers, have been invited to participate in these hearings. So, this is where the rubber meets the road, and we'll really see what Donald Trump is going to be charged with.
Do we expect cooperation from the White House?
I think they'll cooperate to the extent that they have to. I mean, recent court decisions have indicated that there is a problem when the White House and people who work for the White House don't cooperate, both in terms of turning over documents, but also in terms of lying to congressional committees. So I think we'll see the minimum level of, cooperation. But I do think that what's really important to keep in mind here is that what comes out of this committee will be what the Senate ultimately has to have a jury trial regarding. Mm-hmm. So these charges are very, very important. It's not going to be a fishing expedition. It's going to actually be identifying what Donald Trump will be charged with.
So let's talk a little bit about politics. The entrance into the Democratic presidential primary field, like Bloomberg, Deval Patrick. We are just weeks away from Iowa. Obviously, two very different candidates, but let's talk about Mike.
Well, Mike Bloomberg is doing something that nobody has been able to do before, which is put forward a strategy whereby he skipped the initial 4 states, which is his only option because he hasn't been campaigning in them, and retail politics in Iowa and New Hampshire, and to some extent Nevada and South Carolina, are really important. And he's going to pursue a Super Tuesday strategy instead. He's just going to sort of go up on the airwaves and hope that this broad national campaign will net him the number of delegates that he needs to move forward. Now, the reason this hasn't worked for anybody in the past is because nobody has had the amount of money required to simultaneously be up in so many states. Mm-hmm. But with half the delegates at play, he thinks it's worth the risk. Now, the person who has the most to lose from this could potentially be Joe Biden, because although I don't expect Mike Bloomberg to do particularly well, carving off even 4 or 5% of that moderate vote could be enough to land Biden in second place in a lot of these places where he was planning to come in first.
Let's talk about some of the criticism against Mike Bloomberg from the Democratic Party given to GOP candidates. Supported Scott Brown over Elizabeth Warren.
And not only that, I mean, he's been every party himself, right? He's been a Republican. He's been an independent. He's now running as a Democrat. In a general election, that might have some appeal, although as people have become increasingly partisan and as polarization has come to divide this country like it's never been before, I don't know how much appeal that would have. But in a Democratic primary, it's certainly troublesome, especially given that there are other moderate candidates, especially Joe Biden, but also Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, who are hardcore Democrats, but also sort of take this more moderate approach. So it's hard to figure out exactly whether and where Mike Bloomberg's lane is. But given the amount of money that he's able to spend, and frankly, given that we saw in 2016, Donald Trump was able to basically buy himself the nomination, I don't think we should be particularly willing to just sort of brush him aside as, sort of out on a lark.
Now, I'm sure you've seen some of the media. We certainly have here. I mean, how could you not with the amount of money that he is spending? What have you thought of his ads so far and how he is presenting himself and in some instances really introducing himself to the greater American public?
Right. I mean, He's clearly running a very professional, very compelling ad campaign, and he's running against Donald Trump. It's basically a situation where you have two billionaires pitted against one another. One is this self-made billionaire who's this guy who, this boy who made good is basically what Mike Bloomberg's strategy is. And then you have Donald Trump, who in 2016 sort of portrayed himself as the blue-collar billionaire. So neither of them want to be known for their riches. Neither of them want to necessarily be known for their money and how it makes them maybe unable to relate to the typical voter. But both of them have run campaigns and have put forward strategies that make it clear that they're not your traditional candidate. But I mean, I think he's running based on the campaign ads. It's hard not to take it seriously. The issue is just whether it's a feasible strategy to become the Democratic Party's nominee.
So you talk about the similarities between Trump and Bloomberg, obviously both with an inordinate amount of resources at their disposal. But personality-wise and sort of presence-wise, obviously Trump engenders a lot of excitement from his base. Is there an excited base for Mike Bloomberg?
No, there's not, especially in the Democratic primary. Right. So, this is another situation where the only thing that Mike Bloomberg has going for him right now, in addition to money, is this general, assumption that the Democrats want to elect whomever they think has the best shot at beating Donald Trump. They don't have to be in love with the candidate. They have to identify the candidate that they think will win. And that's the argument that Bloomberg is trying to make. If this was a love story, many of the candidates who are still on that stage would probably not be standing there. So, I think that that's ultimately what he's trying to do. And he's hoping that by portraying himself as a moderate, by saying he's worked with Republicans in the past, that he'll be able to convince Democrats that he'll be able to get independent and maybe even some moderate Republicans to vote for him in the general election.
And what was Deval Patrick's path to victory in entering the 2020 Democratic primary?
So there is no path. I don't get it. Now, I think that in some ways he wishes that he would have entered earlier. And maybe if he had entered earlier and had been on that debate stage and had been around since the beginning, he would have been able to generate a degree of momentum and enthusiasm. But frankly, it's too late. And although the Democratic establishment might not be thrilled with the choices and wish that by this point there had been a clear frontrunner, Democratic voters are actually looking to winnow the field, right? Everybody is pretty happy with the candidates. Most Democrats want to start to narrow it down so that they can get behind one person, but they're not complaining that they don't like their choices. So it's a little bit unclear what path Deval Patrick is trying to pursue. And he had an event over the weekend or at the end of last week and basically had to cancel it because nobody showed up. And I don't think that's because nobody would support him if he were the nominee. It's unclear that he needs to run at this time. It's just too late in the process.
And so final question, I know I'd asked before, you talk about the impact of Bloomberg running on Biden, but let's talk a little bit, Sanders, Warren, Mayor Pete. You mentioned clearly that Bloomberg has a capacity to siphon off voters who might be going towards Biden, but then who really benefits in the end?
Well, under ordinary circumstances, you'd think that if Biden voters were knocked off, that would ultimately help the progressive candidate, right? But here you've got these weird situations where, for example, the people who favor Bernie Sanders are most likely to put Joe Biden as their second place candidate, right? You'd think that a Bernie Sanders voter would opt for Elizabeth Warren in second place. Mayor Pete's voters don't necessarily go to Biden if they don't like Mayor Pete. And so there's quite a bit of uncertainty. It's not really there's no ideological constraint among the voters. So it's hard to know. So you can imagine that, knocking off some of Biden's support would ultimately put Sanders and Warren in a relatively stronger position. But as long as the two of them are still dividing this progressive vote, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe without knocking off 10% of Biden's vote, it's an irrelevant entry into the race. It's just hard to know. The one thing I will say is that the impeachment hearings have the potential to really change this, because Biden and Buttigieg and Bloomberg benefit from not having to be in the Senate and not having to, basically go off the campaign trail for we can only imagine how long to weigh into these impeachment hearings the way that the 5 senators do.
Any reason to think, as you said, getting off the campaign trail, but also the visibility factor of really being in the midst of it? Any bump there, or is it just mitigated by the fact that, again, they're stuck inside the Beltway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's stuck inside the Beltway. They're going to be sort of mired in very, very partisan politics. It's also a situation where, again, it's these 50 statewide campaigns that really matter. It's people are not generally making their decision by watching MSNBC or CNN to figure out who they want their nominee to be. They want to know what's actually going on in their state. That's certainly true in the early states. So if these hearings begin in January and heading into Iowa and New Hampshire, Booker and Harris and Sanders and Klobuchar and Warren are unable to be on the campaign trail to the same extent that they ordinarily would, it's hard to see that not meaning that they take some kind of a hit.
Well, here we are again on the eve of the Thanksgiving holiday. Might be Jennifer Lawless's parents calling as we speak on the way.
It is. I'm sorry about this. I had a crazy dog in the background. I have a phone call. You know that it's a holiday weekend coming.
We wish that we could see the crazy dog in the background, but as always, we appreciate getting the time to pick your brain about national politics from the University of Virginia. So Jennifer Lawless, we're going to let you go and have a great Thanksgiving.
Thanks. Happy Thanksgiving.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for watching this afternoon. We'll be back tomorrow morning with Smart Health here in the studio in downtown Providence. But of course, find us on GoLocalProv.com and on Facebook throughout the Tuesday evening. And we'll see you back here tomorrow. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.